For millennia, the Kumeyaay people have been a part of this land. This land has nourished, healed, protected, and embraced them for many generations in a relationship of balance and harmony. As members of the San Diego State community, we acknowledge this legacy. We promote this balance and harmony. We find inspiration from this land, the land of the Kumeyaay. The goal of One SDSU Community is to provide opportunities for you to learn about yourselves and the perspectives, experiences, and identities that make you unique, allowing you to connect with other students to learn about their journeys. By having all these opportunities, the hope is that ultimately every member of the SDSU community comes to embrace diversity in all its forms, bringing our community together as one diverse group. One SDSU's programming framework has 3 themes, and this afternoon's theme is Activating Community Dialogue. Together, we will be engaging in activities that provide learning about identities through both self-exploration and exploring others' perspectives. Over the course of today's panel discussion, feel free to make comments in the chat box. And if you'd like to pose a question to one of our speakers, please post it in the Q&A. At the end of the program, we will invite you to share about your experience in a brief survey. We hope you will take a few minutes to share your thoughts before you leave today. Now, I'd like to turn it over to Eric Smigel, Chair of Arts Alive SDSU. Eric?
Good afternoon, everyone, and happy Earth Day. I'm pleased to welcome you to the 6th production in this year's Arts Alive SDSU Discovery Series, which is an annual selection of events that address sociopolitical and cultural issues through the visual and performing arts. We're delighted to continue our partnership this semester with One SDSU, who is sponsoring these interdisciplinary panel discussions. And I'd like to thank Michelle and the team at Student Life and Leadership for their ongoing support of arts programming across campus. Today's discussion focuses on Winds of Change, a virtual concert by the SDSU Wind Symphony. The performance features powerful, reflective, and inspiring instrumental music addressing the close connection between climate change and the human experience. Directed by Professor Shannon Kitelinger from the School of Music and Dance, this production showcases an extraordinary group of dedicated students who have spent months rehearsing and recording in some rather unusual settings. The performance would normally have taken place in a concert hall with a live audience, but I think we all abandoned normality over a year ago. Indeed, we've all been navigating some fiercely shifting winds, and we hope the Winds of Change project reminds us how essential collaboration is when confronting such complex issues as climate change. As we consider the critical research conducted in the sciences, the arts and humanities can instill in us a powerful sense of urgency and agency, helping us to recognize that our individual and collective responses to global challenges make a profound difference. It's now my pleasure to introduce our featured panelists, Professor Shannon Kitelinger from the School of Music and Dance and Director of the SDSU Wind Symphony, Professor Alan Gontz, Chair of the Department of Geological Sciences, and our special guest artist, the composer of Automatic Earth, Steven Bryant.
Thank you, Eric, for the introduction. Thank you, Michelle, as well. Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Shannon Kitelinger, as Dr. Smigel mentioned, the Director of Bands here at San Diego State University. I'd like to thank Eric Smigel and Arts Alive SDSU, as well as One SDSU, for not only making this discussion today possible, but also for affording us the opportunity to create this event, culminating in the online performance of the 2 compositions tomorrow at noon. That will be up for a week after that. As musicians, one of the primary ways we express ourselves is through live performance, which has made the past year difficult to navigate, to say the least. Because of this support from this event from all involved, I know that both myself and the musicians in the Wind Symphony have been able to feel a degree of normalcy in creating something that we're excited to share with everyone. I'm, of course, also extremely excited to be part of the panel today, and in a few minutes to continue the discussion and speak with our 2 featured guests. Before we start the panel, though, I'd like to talk a bit about this project, the genesis of it, and the process that we've gone through to get where we are today on Earth Day 2021. Winds of Change is a play on words. The SDSU Wind Symphony is a concert band made up primarily of wind instruments, woodwinds, percussion, and brass. But this project also acknowledges the growing problems associated with the world's climate crisis and our need to adjust our ways of life to ensure the future of our planet. We have spent the last year adjusting, and we need to continue even as the pandemic hopefully moves past. The project goes back to December 2019, when the Wind Symphony first performed a work by our guest composer today, Steven Bryant, entitled Automatic Earth. SDSU and the Wind Symphony were part of a consortium of nearly 100 different schools and ensembles that commissioned Steven to write that work. December 2019 was when we were able to give our premiere performance of that piece in San Diego. Unfortunately, not many performances of that followed as the world shut down. That performance really sparked conversations amongst our musicians and students about how we view the climate crisis and how we as artists respond, comment, and interact with global warming. A few months later, I received an email inviting us to be involved in another world premiere performance, this time a work by Zachary Friedland about global warming, but how it affects our oceans. His father is an oceanography person, and he has a lot of research in this. I immediately responded yes to this, to joining the consortium, and our journey began to this day. That piece is called Shifting Seas, and we're going to see that one in a little bit. It's been an amazing complement to Steven's Automatic Earth. In different ways, the two compositions caution us about our current trajectory in regard to the environment. I'd like to speak a little bit about the preparation process for this event, because it's made the event what it is right now. As I said earlier, the project began in fall 2019 and spring 2020, prior to the start of the pandemic. What was originally to be an indoor concert presentation this spring soon became apparent that it would need to change drastically if we're going to realize it. Performing in ensembles is an integral part of our lives as musicians, and it's vitally important for student musicians. If we were going to continue to be able to make music safely together in a distant environment, we are going to need to rethink how and where we practice and perform. Many schools were creating virtual bands and recording individually and creating an ensemble online, but that is not the ensemble experience. That is not the musician to musician, soul to soul experience that we've been able to recreate since October, adjusting to make it work. The Wind Symphony spent the fall of 2020 essentially relearning how to rehearse and make the music that we love, doing in a distance and safe environment. One of the benefits of being in San Diego is that we've been able to rehearse outdoors throughout the academic year with relatively few interruptions. Well, that's certainly been a benefit. The music that the Wind Symphony performs typically, and the music for this project, doesn't exactly lend itself well to outdoor distanced performances. There are nuances throughout both works that you'll hear parts of today and all of tomorrow that are very difficult to accomplish when the students are sitting 12 feet away from one another. We followed CDC guidelines, and we watched very closely the aerosol studies that were coming out around the nation throughout the past year, so that we could find a way, with permission from the university and the chancellor's office, to come back safely to campus and make music together. Unfortunately, few, if any, indoor spaces on our campus can actually house the number of musicians that we have and also comply to all those guidelines. So we moved outdoors with birds chirping, students walking around campus, gusts of wind, and of course in San Diego, skateboarders riding around campus during our rehearsals. I honestly didn't know throughout the fall and the entire spring, early spring, I would say, if we'd even be able to present this project today. This spring, we've embarked on outdoor rehearsals and spent hours with student videographers and recording interns, trying different microphone setups and configurations to try to capture all those subtleties and nuances that are so integral to both of these compositions. The result, I believe, is something that represents our students and the works well, and that we are proud of and ready to present to you. One additional note about this project: the Discovery Series events at SDSU are unique and meant to center around our SDSU community. Since we needed to rethink so many things, we also decided to rethink our performance venues. Jokingly, Alan at one meeting earlier said, well, why don't you just perform on the top of a parking structure? And I said, we're already rehearsing in the parking structures. Let's go someplace different. The two preview videos that I'll show you today were filmed in unique spaces on our campus. With approval from the university, we filmed the works at Montezuma Hall in the Student Union and at the newly opened Healing Garden on campus. We're so excited to show you the new Healing Garden space today. I have a picture of it here. Okay. As a matter of fact, we're excited because we're one of the first events that have happened in the Healing Garden since the pandemic delayed the opening ceremonies last spring. The space and the inspirations behind the land itself lend themselves to the discussions we're about to have today about global warming and change. The garden represents the concepts of healing, emotionally, mentally, physically. The garden recognizes the indigenous cultures of this land. The design incorporates cardinal directions as well as the axis mundi through primary pathways. The lines of the garden form a circular pattern pathway that captures the kumeyaay coiled basket design and the serpent of the Aztecs. The shared sacred colors of black, red, blue, and white that are all affiliated with the cardinal directions are also captured in natural decomposed granite that forms the pathways. I encourage you to read more about this new healing garden on the SDSU president's website. With that, I'd like to share with you the first of our 2 musical excerpts for tomorrow's online concert. The first sample includes 3 short clips of our world premiere performance of Zach Friedland's Shifting Seas. As I said earlier, the work is about the effects climate change is having on our oceans. So with no further ado, I will take over the screen share, and this is Zachary Friedland's Shifting Seas. All right, and now moving on, now to welcome our 2 guests to the discussion. We have with us today Dr. Alan Gontz. Dr. Gontz serves as the chair of geology department at San Diego State University, specializing in climate change and other forms of geomorphology. He also has a strong interest in the arts, collaborating with a number of departments across campus on projects such as this one. Welcome, Alan. Can you share maybe a little bit about yourself and your work with global warming and the climate crisis?
Thanks, Shannon. I'd be happy to. So by training, I'm a geologist, and most geologists study rocks. However, I use those rocks that compose a landscape to evaluate how climate has changed in the past by looking at changes to landscapes. So that's led me to a lot of really interesting places around the world. And when Eric and Shannon came to me with this idea about being a panelist in Winds of Change, I thought, wow, that fits right in with most of my research, because my main project that I'm working on now is using sand dunes that have accumulated over the past 1.1 million years to unravel how climate has changed in Australia. And it's also spans the time of when our current glacial climate systems have come to be. So this was a fantastic opportunity to engage with the arts and engage with some wonderful musicians and start a conversation, which I think is one of the most powerful things about pieces such as this, is the capacity to start the conversation.
Great, thanks. Can I tell my musicians in the chat what you told me, that you're a former trombone player? Yes.
Yes, you can. In fact, you did before you asked. So
There you go. I was going to do it anyway. Thanks so much. And then also, please help us welcome composer and friend Steven Bryant. Steven is a prolific composer and conductor whose music is regularly performed around the world. His music fuses lyricism, dissonance, silence, technology, and humor into skillfully crafted works that enthrall both listeners and performers. He studied composition with John Corigliano at the Juilliard School, Cindy McTeen at the University of North Texas, and Francis Macbeth at Washita. Steven, welcome. We're excited to have you here with us today. Can you speak a little bit at this point to what drew you to compose the Automatic Earth?
Sure. Thank you for having me be part of this. So as you mentioned, this piece was commissioned by 100 ensembles. It was led by Gary Hill, the director of Arizona State University. I just retired. And so he actually approached me several years ago and said, I want you to write us a very large piece with electronics that makes us uncomfortable. And so that prompt sent me down this path. And I thought about writing something that deals with climate change. It's obviously been on my mind for a while. And I couldn't figure out how do you write music about this that is still hopefully a decent piece of music. And for me, music has to stand alone as well, even if you don't know the extra musical meanings. And so that sent me off down this, and I started thinking about not just this crisis that we're in, because I didn't want to write a piece that was just all dread and despair, even though that is often the mental state I've found myself in, the deeper I go into the facts and figures. But it's more of an introspection and psychological journey of me dealing with this, and introspection and melancholy permeates it, and uncertainty and ambiguity. And a lot of the musical choices I make don't quite resolve ever. And so that's the overview of the piece. It's 5 connected movements. There's not really a break between them. It's a pretty large work. And again, there's electronics involved in it. So a lot of sounds, some you can't tell the difference what is acoustic and what's electronic. And that's also, I like that because there is another layer to this technological layer. I've been long fascinated with the augmentation of human beings. We have an Apple Watch. We're always augmenting what it is to be human. And as we get more and more desperate to survive on this planet, our attempts to engineer our way out of this are going to get more and more extravagant, desperate, bizarre. So the piece is not just about, oh no, everything's getting really bad. It's also about how we're going to react, and the future, the very near future, is going to be very weird.
Yeah, you mentioned the fact that a lot of the parts don't resolve, and as we've been working on both yours and Zach's pieces, which are starkly different, there are moments in Zach's piece where he does not resolve things in a very similar fashion that you do, and we found that fascinating to discover. Everybody, for our second musical excerpt, we're going to play 3 short clips of our performance of Steven's Automatic Earth, which was filmed in Montezuma Hall at our student union. As he mentioned, there are 5 total movements in it. These clips are going to show brief moments of the first, second, and fourth movement. And the first movement's entitled A Slow Fire. Second movement is entitled Days of Miracle and Wonder. And then the fourth movement is entitled Automatic Earth. All right. So I'll take over the screen and we'll listen to a little premiere of tomorrow's release of the Automatic Earth. Wow, that's a lot. That's amazing. Steven, would you mind sharing a little bit about maybe what we just heard?
Sure. So I don't know if you can tell how loud that where we stopped was. That's the moment of maximum discomfort. It's toward the end of the fourth movement, so we'll come back to that. The section played from the first movement called A Slow Fire, and that title is one of two from the poetry of Robinson Jeffers, who's an ecological poet, coined this idea of inhumanism. And you should go read about him. I'm certainly not an expert, but it sets the stage for the piece. This chorale section you heard, always again kind of straddling this major minor tonality, which is where this unsettled, unease comes from. And that comes back throughout the whole piece. But it sets the stage, and I think you can kind of think of A Slow Fire, the imagery there. I think that's pretty clear how that can fit. The second movement, Days of Miracle and Wonder, this is one of two titles from the lyrics of Paul Simon, Boy in the Bubble. And this is music of kind of forced manic joy that is a little bit too optimistic for its own good. Like this grin and bear it smile. It's going to be great. We're going to geoengineer our way out of this. Technology will save the day, that sort of thing. And so it's just bright and happy, energetic music, but it's always a little bit too forced and a little too much. And it finally explodes. You didn't get to that part at the end, but again, on this massive major minor stacked chord. And then we go to the third movement, which is very introspective. And then we go to the fourth movement, which you played a clip of, which is the title work, Automatic Earth, which is also from Paul Simon's lyrics. And it moves with this inexorable kind of relentlessness, mechanistic. The electronics take over more, and the groove and that sort of thing. And then it finally explodes in that moment you played, but which is way more powerful live, which is always the case. And so it's sort of, I guess, just this relentlessness and the fact that this is not going to stop, and it's going to get weirder and weirder as well, not just worse, but weird. So those are those three clips that you played from a much larger work. The whole work's like 30 minutes, so it's very hard to give someone a sense of the arc of the whole journey in this, but it's pretty good.
Yeah, it's great to hear all your influences, the Robinson Jeffers, the Paul Simon. I think at one point you cited Westworld with this.
Yeah, I'm a total nerd, so I love that series. That the first season is particularly exquisitely crafted. And there's a quote I just love from one of the main characters, Dolores Abernathy. Sometimes a strange new light is more frightening than the dark. And that's where I drew for the title for the fifth movement, The Language of Light, which is sort of where we've crossed over into something. I don't know, you can feel like we're underwater. That wasn't originally intentional, but yeah.
Yeah, and I don't want to. I want to bring Alan into the conversation, but I do. You bring up the water, and you have the lighting effects. In our recording tomorrow, you'll see we are flooded in blue. So it's fantastic. Alan, Steven was talking a lot about the art influences that influence his music, the poetry, and that's I even brought up the others. Where do you are such a valuable part of this panel. We had you the other day, and just all the facts you bring to the table and all your knowledge is it's unbelievable. We're so glad to have you here. Where do you see, I see you working with other projects across campus and collaborating. Where do you see the arts playing a role in this crisis that we're dealing with?
Thanks, Shannon. You know, that's a really interesting thing, and one of the reasons why I really like collaborating with Arts Alive and some of the other relations on campus that I do. As scientists, we often have a really hard time getting our message out. We often talk in jargon and technical terms and make things really difficult for anybody who's not in our discipline to understand what it is that we do. And everybody can listen to music and it moves you. Everybody can look at a painting and you can see something in that painting that you can relate to. And when we can start to work together and collaborate and bring science and the arts together, we can take the scientific experience and merge it with the artistic performance and have it be a way to start conversation, get content out to individuals and out to the greater public to be able to engage with and understand. And that's something that we as scientists often struggle with. And part of that is the way that we're trained, where when we actually talk about our science and what it is that we do, we talk about it from a standpoint of, you know, nothing is ever proven. We try to disprove a theory. but we never truly prove a theory. We just kind of eliminate possibilities. So when you put us on the spot and ask, is this truly happening? Scientists will often hedge because that's the way we're trained and that's what we're taught to do. And to be able to bring the arts in where, as we can see from Steven's piece, that hedging doesn't really exist. And it can really drive home some of these other messages that we have.
Great. Thanks. I want to encourage everybody, all the attendees, please feel free to use the chat throughout this. We have folks backstage monitoring all of this, and we will be happy to get to your questions if you have any questions or even commentary. We want to make this as interactive as possible, so please don't make this just a panel about the three of us talking. This is really, we are in the free-form kind of conversation point of this panel, and we want to continue moving forward with that. I think, let's see here. You had mentioned bringing the science to the audience, and I know that we as musicians, when we first performed the Automatic Earth, had conversations in the ensembles that I don't think we were having before, and I think that's really important. Steven, you had talked about an overlay of technology and kind of engineering our way out of this. Do you want to maybe expand on that for us?
Sure. So a little background, about 12 years ago, I wrote a piece called Ecstatic Waters. First time I integrated electronics on a large scale with a large acoustic ensemble. And at that time, I was really taken with transhumanism and Ray Kurzweil and all this, the idea that we will eventually upload ourselves and become more than human. And I was a lot more into it than I have now come to. I don't know, I'm getting old, I guess, but I don't know that it's a great thing, but I also think it's inevitable. And so that being accelerated by our desperation as a species to survive, and the interplay of that really, really fascinates me. And so that's the kind of the driving force there with the electronics and the technological interest and just how we're running the world's biggest experiment on the entire world system by injecting so much energy into it, and causing this climate crisis without having any clue what's going to happen. And so I don't see us stopping though, that's the real solution, is that we have to reduce. It always leaves that out of the reduce, reuse, recycle portion, but that's the real solution here. And I just don't know that we're going to do that. Sorry.
I mean, yeah, we have to change, right? And so, Alan, in your research, I mean, do you have any research that talks about the changes we have to make, or how we as humans are not making those changes?
Well, as a geologist, my work is mainly backward looking. So I'm not looking specifically into the future, but a lot of the things that we do as geologists brings us perspective and brings us a background as to what things were like in the past. And show us when certain things happen, what are those consequences? So we can use that to kind of guide our thinking as to what's going on. So we have a lot of really great information about what happened the last time the ice sheets melted and how high sea level was. And the bathtub rings of that exist all around the world in form of raised beaches and islands that are no longer islands. And it's really prevalent in places like the East Coast of the US and North Carolina, where you can see the line of islands inside the big lagoons behind the Great Barrier, or behind the Barrier Islands of Kitty Hawk and Oak Grove and places like that. But knowing exactly where we're going to go is one of these great unknowns, and looking into the past to try to help find it. Because of the things that have happened, landscape artifacts have been laid down, we're basically trying to look at a book that has pages torn out of it and trying to figure out what happens in between the pages and trying to put together a story. So there's a lot of interpretation, and there's a lot of almost imagination that goes on in our process to try to understand how events in the past have led to where we are in the present. And then to be able to take that and kind of understand what that looks like into the future is really a challenge, because most of it's done with computer models. And if computer models were perfect, we would never, ever walk out the door without forgetting our umbrella. because we would know exactly what's going to happen into the future. And the fact that we can't predict the weather that's going to happen in the next 30 or 60 minutes with a lot of degree of confidence, really shows that we don't have an understanding of the Earth as a system and how we can actually plan for the consequences of something that we do.
Oh, I'm going to stay on you a little bit because Eric has asked something in the chat. If you'd be interested, he's interested in hearing how your own experiences with art have informed your professional research.
So that's an interesting question from a standpoint. And I do a lot of photography with the work that I do, and part of it's to be able to go back and reconstruct landscapes. So I'm kind of an amateur avid photographer of landscapes that helps my research. The work that I do interpreting the types of data I have, a lot of it's imagery based, and a lot of it is trying to understand exactly how you might relate things back and forth, and having an understanding of some of the artistic principles of painting and drawing and photography helps us to kind of build some of those experiences and relate some of the data that we have all the way through to the end product. And we often as scientists look for the most simple and most elegant solution. And a lot of those simple and elegant solutions come from being a little bit more creative and having a little bit more of a perspective that's broader than just looking at the science, but having a background in the arts as well.
Yeah, Adrienne has something here. She's asking her a comment that teaches engineering on the Sunshine Coast in Australia, and they briefly examine the role of the arts, music, and drama, etc., to stimulate divergent thought. This can then help us to develop previously unconsidered solutions to problems.
Full disclosure, Adrian's one of my research colleagues that I work with in Australia quite frequently. And he is a phenomenal multidisciplinary, transdisciplinary individual. And this is one of the things that I really wish we could do so much more of, which is why the interdisciplinary teaching collaborative that Eric and the Arts Alive team has, that tries to bring the arts and sciences together to make individuals look at problems and situations with a slightly different lens to be a little bit more creative is really powerful. And I'm glad to hear that they're doing that in Adrian's classrooms in Australia as well.
I'd be curious to hear if there's been any particular music or art that has successfully done that or shows promise in sparking divergent thought in ways that actually are fruitful for scientists.
Oh, I had a great experience 2 years ago now. I was teaching a class in Madrid, Spain, in a little town outside of it. And my wife and I got a chance to go to one of the museums, and we got to see the Hieronymus Bosch painting, Garden of Earthly Delights. And to actually sit and look at that work of art and the stories that were told in them and how the different landscape components were woven into it really kind of made me wonder that how something that is that old could be portrayed in that way with such an amazing understanding of environmental aspects and concepts that were woven through those 3 different panels in the Garden of Earthly Delights. And that is a piece that, as a geologist, I could really use as a teaching tool. And there are so many other works of art out there that deal with interpretations of landscapes and representations of landscapes. But I also think one of the really great things to be able to do is to use art and be able to have individuals interpret some of the things from more realistic types of art, like the image behind me in my background, which is a volcanic crater lake in Australia. And to be able to look at that and try to understand the processes that are going on that shape the landscape and how they may have changed just by looking at it is a really, really powerful tool as well.
I'm seeing some questions in the chat about electronics. I kind of want to hold that off for a second, but maybe come at it tangentially a little bit. Steven, you had kind of mentioned the electronics and how they work and engineering ourselves and engineering our way out of this. What are some of your thoughts? Like, have you done any research on how we're engineering our way out of this climate crisis? I guess for this piece in particular, but I'm sure you don't just limit yourself to this.
I'm actually reading this book right now, Under the White Sky by The Nature of the Future, which is basically about that. I'm not that far into it yet, but it looks really promising. Do it old school that way. If anybody's interested. And you know, just all about the ways we've engineered things to get to this point and how we have to keep going forward because, you know, the canal from the Chicago River, which basically reversed the flow of all the water and the sewage from Chicago, used to go into the Great Lakes. Now it goes the other direction, and it connected the two water systems from Mississippi and the one into the Great Lakes. And so now there's this whole Asian carp problem, and just one problem leads to another. And so now they've electrified the water in there to keep, the larger the fish, the more electrified, the more repelled they are by it. So that's one way of them trying to keep them from getting through. Which is all these crazy solutions. You know, introducing one that seems to cascade that calls for an even more complicated solution on top of that. And I know there are just unending series of examples like that. I know the idea of spewing either sulfur into the sky or something stuff like that to kind of darken and which would change the color of the sky. I think that's what the title refers to. I haven't gotten that part yet. To reduce the amount of sunlight and heat getting into the earth. You know, we're trying to reduce the energy system in the system. But that just seems insane. Like, what is that going to do to everything else? And that doesn't do anything about the acidification of the oceans. This is massively the most complex system we know. It's our entire planet, and we're just trying these crazy blunt force experiments without any control or preparation. And so those are the sorts of things. And you can, the more you dig, the more you find these amazing, crazy ideas. And so sorry, I keep going off the rails. When I start thinking about this, my mind just starts like, oh God, this is going to be crazy. And it's coming now. So just trying to paint that into a musical sense and capture that with, make a familiar sonic world, the band, or classical music ensemble, and augment it and change it so that it feels, in unexpected ways, it does things you don't expect in a familiar space. And so that's probably the closest analog. I will record analog instruments and do things to them. Like at the end of the piece, this clarinet plays the solo, and then it's actually at one point just the recorded clarinet, but you don't know what's real and what's not. And then it starts disintegrating in unexpected ways. And I love that sort of mental, that surprise and that violation of expectation in music. That's one of my guiding principles in how to create music that creates drama, that pulls you in, it makes you feel comfortable, and then takes you somewhere you didn't expect, yet feels inevitable. So that's one of the ways I do that. And then just augmenting what the power, you know, we're all inundated and surrounded by music, amplified music, wall-to-wall wallpaper sound, pretty much all day, every day. And it carries so much power and bass frequencies and things that are not normally inherent in a classical acoustic ensemble. And so I like to fill those frequencies and have that power available to me as well. And viscerally move the audience and try to connect them and make them unable to turn away from this.
Steven, it's really interesting that you mentioned the changing the color of the sky and the atmosphere by pushing sulfur into the atmosphere as a way to try to cool it. In 1815, Mount Tambora erupted, and it was one of the most violent eruptions that we have in our historical record. And the amount of sulfur dioxide and ash and gases that were put into the atmosphere caused a profound impact on climate. It actually caused climate to cool because it prevented so much of the solar radiation from getting to the surface of the earth. It led to, in the east coast of the United States, in Boston, the year without a summer. And there was snow in Boston in July. Now, this is a really interesting time because it was recognized around the world as something that was going on, and it has led to a lot of great works of art. And in fact, it's the time, because of all of the failure of crops and the dark summers and the cold summers, that Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein. So when you start thinking about some of these aspects of the impact of climate, and if we change things, you know, what are some of those implications? Well, we have an analog for what happens if you change the color of the sky and block out sunlight. We do get a cooler Earth, but we also have some of these other things that happen. And you can kind of roll that forward to every time there is a somewhat major volcanic eruption, but not one that has led to a lot of dramatic climate change. The amount of ash changes the color of the sky, and it's one of those times when we get phenomenal sunset paintings by all the artists around the world.
I always joke about this piece I wrote called Dusk, which is just a sunset. But I used this image of a sunset I witnessed when I lived in New York City. I lived on the 22nd floor of the dorm at Juilliard, and I had a window, my little window faced due west out over New Jersey, and I witnessed some pretty spectacular, crazy sunsets. I always joke it's because of the pollution over New Jersey.
It's absolutely due to the pollution over New York City.
We live so close to LA with the smog, and it continues. One of the things I do enjoy, just to step back, Stephen, about your use of electronics and how you incorporate it is how you do blur the line between the two. And I specifically wanted to ask you earlier about that clarinet, why the clarinet is electronic when they're sitting 10 feet away from me. And I think and the muted trumpets that will be in the electronics voice. And I think it's fascinating, as opposed to some of these pieces that were in the 70s when it was tape accompaniment along with the band. It was just this disjunct. And I will say also that I remember working with you early on, and your notes very distinctly to say put the speakers in the ensemble. The electronics are a part of the ensemble, and that grafting of the two. I really enjoy that with how you bring electronics to it. There was a question in here along that, if Stephen, if you had any particular scientific resources that shaped your imagination when you composed something like the Automatic Earth.
I should put together a bibliography. I don't even, off the top of my head, I don't know. You know, I a lot of scattered reading around the internet of following facts and figures as far as I can go until I start to, you know, get blurry-eyed. But let me get back to you on that. I can't, of course, now I'm totally blanking out when you ask the question, but just a lot of, you know, there's websites like 350.org and Project Drawdown and some things like that that will just give you some really basic, perfect for the layman, like here's where we are, here's how much each country is putting out, how much they put out over historical times, and just some image of that, and start to get yourself situated into how massive this problem is and how the solution has to be a totality. There's not a single pointed solution. It's not electric cars, and it's not any one thing. It's everything top to bottom has to be transformed in the society. And so I've read just all sorts of, I don't know, articles. There's a really great article called Loving a Vanishing World by Emily Johnston. In fact, I can post that in the chat in a second, which sums all that up and deals more with how to deal with this as a person and as an artist in this world. And that's something that I wrestle with a lot. Writing this is my own culpability, my own participation in this, because all of us, certainly by existing in the Western world, just moving, doing anything does damage. And it's part and parcel of how this entire system is set up. So I know I'm getting away from the original question, but that's something I wrestle with a lot. And I fly on airplanes and I feel bad about it. My wife is from Austria and we go there every summer. So that's at least one international plane trip every summer. That we can't actually keep doing this, but we keep doing it, all of us. So I have to sit in that space of I'm part of the problem.
I have a favorite singer-songwriter who wrote a piece about how he hates cruise ships because of how bad they are for the environment. But at the same time, he thinks about each individual on a cruise ship booking their own flight and going on vacation elsewhere, and it has more impact on it. We're seeing a lot of questions in the chat pertaining to this. How do we deal with this? Alan, I've heard you speak before about, and you know, I think about we're in this together. Can you maybe kind of talk about that, the ground roots of what we need to do? Like, yeah, tell us what we need to do, Alan.
I would be more than happy to.
Yeah, thanks.
So, you know, this is one of those problems that's going to take a village, and it's going to take the entire village. So unlike, you know, so when we learn in geography in high school and in elementary school and middle school, They give us a map, and they color all the different states in the United States. And then Canada is this white spot, and Mexico is this white spot, and then there's blue ocean around us. And we're led to believe that kind of we operate in this country, and that there's not anything else really outside of it, and that everything that we do stops at the international border, and somehow the international border is these big amazing fences that stop things from flowing back and forth between them, and more so than even things like people, but content. So when you start to think about places like Sudbury, Canada, which is one of the places where they've done an amazing amount of mining for all of the copper and sulfur oriented minerals that we have, and the smelting process of that is one of the things that has led to a lot of the acid rain that we had in the 70s and 80s in the northeast part of the United States, because all of that particulate matter and all the sulfur dioxide that was put into the atmosphere got into the winds, and it moved southeast across the Great Lakes and into the forests of New York and Pennsylvania, causing a lot of acid rain, a lot of forest death, and things like that. So none of this stuff stops at a border. So in order for this to happen, the entire village has to work together. So we could do what our president has just announced that we're going to do, and that's cut our emissions by 50% in the next less than a decade, by 2030. But if we cut our emissions by 50% and the rest of the world does nothing, then that 50% that we've cut our emissions for is really not going to make a huge amount of impact on the global problem. So it's going to take everybody to do something. And it's not going to take just a couple of developed countries around the world to make a jump to things like renewable energy and break away from a tide to fossil fuels. It's actually going to take those developing countries not only making that move, but turning around and giving that technology to every other country and facilitating them buying into and making use of those technologies so that everybody can reduce their emissions by 50%. And if we can all reduce our emissions by 50% across the entire globe, then we can make a dent. Just as an aside to that, yesterday or the day before yesterday, we hit 420 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere. It's a level that we haven't seen in millions of years. And what's most worrisome about this is not actually the level that we're hitting, because there have been times in Earth's history where we have been well over 1,000 parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, back at the time of the dinosaurs, when we were in Earth systems that were much warmer. Now, it's not the level that's concerning, it's the rate of increase. The rate of increase that we're seeing is nothing like we have ever experienced in geologic history. And it's that rate that is going to cause the problem, because we can't keep up with ourselves. So the carbon emissions are outpacing the Earth's capacity to deal with it in a natural way. So not only do we have to figure out a way to reduce our carbon emissions, we've got to figure out a way to sequester the carbon out of the atmosphere and reduce those levels back down. So it's a two-part problem. Reduction is only part of the story. Removal is another part of that system as well.
Trying to catch up with the chat here.
Yeah, there's a lot going on in the chat right now.
Several directions.
Yes, we certainly go. Riley Hill has mentions that Alan mentioned this earlier, one of the difficulties of STEM. And I will say there were some things that Alan was just saying, I struggle to keep up with everything. So this guy, maybe I'll go there. There's the gap between STEM jargon to inform the public. This gap leads to many to believe in climate change, even anti-vaxxers, etc. Why do we see this type of Dunning-Kruger effect with science information and not the expertise of musicians/art? One can easily tell the difference between good music and art, but it seems that the same can't be said about information. Is there any advice that STEM could do to maintain the ethos that art and music seem to maintain?
I'm going to answer this question with a question to Steven, and that is, Steven, have you ever gotten mixed reviews on your work?
Always. Yeah, no, I think that's the comment here is too charitable a view of the art and music world. There is wide disagreement on what makes good or bad art. But I guess we're not arguing whether it's true or false. It's a little bit different. In a way, it's all false. It's one big, beautiful lie that I'm trying to weave, but hopefully it's a truthful result out of that. You know, when you write a novel, it's not, none of that's true, right? It's fiction by default, but that's hopefully presenting some larger truth that communicates and resonates with you. So I don't know that there's anything music can teach STEM and just the world at large about dealing with misinformation and the capacity and propensity to believe things that are not true. This is something I wrestle with all the time. How do you deprogram people who have and communicate with people who cannot and refuse to be open to truth and to facts and to a malleable worldview that takes in the facts as we can best know them and build a worldview off of that instead of starting with some sort of belief and then, you know, filtering out only the things that support that. That is a central problem of our entire world society right now that is only being amplified. And man, if I had a solution, I'd be out there applying it in every way possible. I don't know. But sharing this awareness and sharing the fact that this is, you know, I hope that my music connects with a cross section of people. It's not, certainly a lot of my music is in educational ensembles. And so a lot of the students who are playing it are not professional musicians and they're often majoring in other things. And that's a great thing because it's a much broader cross section than when you have a professional orchestra and they're all professional musicians and they only live in that concert hall and they only practice their excerpts. So this is a much broader world that I hope I'm reaching. And I can only hope that the awareness that my music brings to these people then goes out further and spreads. And in my own, you know, enthusiasm for these topics can and hopefully do some good, but I don't have a better answer than that.
I wish there was a simple answer of how we could ensure that the things that we believe is facts and we believe is true. And so some of the issue here is, you know, there's a perception and a belief structure that says that's true, but we're still looking to refine those by disproving things that aren't true. And every time a scientist disproves something, the immediate response is, oh, you were wrong. And because you were wrong then, we're not going to listen to you now. So that is one of those things where we really have to come to grips with this concept of moving into the unknown. Because as we move forward, the things that we're doing, every single step we take is a step really into the unknown and not knowing what is going to happen. And Steven highlighted a couple of these things earlier about, you know, not really knowing where things were going and trying to figure out exactly how to get there. And the impact of one little thing that you do causes a whole spider web of different resultant things that nobody could have understood. And that is where we are, that we're making changes and we're trying to do things to solve what we perceive as a major problem. But because we fully don't understand the Earth as a system, and we don't understand all the interconnections of all the different components of the Earth, when we make a change in one thing, there's something that happens that was an unintended consequence. And that is the biggest thing that we have to be aware of as we move forward, is unintended consequences.
And I think we have to be incredibly adaptable and versatile. And I think as individuals, something I wrestle with, I think that we, to the limit of our emotional capacity and energy, to be kind to one another and try to dismantle all the systems of the ways we are cruel to each other and oppress one another in our society and around the world. I mean, because climate change is only going to amplify all of those fault lines and make things worse. And just wait till food becomes more scarce. I mean, we're going to, you know, so dismantling all of those, it's all intertwined. And in your own personal life, that sort of kindness and malleability of mental life and being ready for things to be very different and your world to be very different, it can't hurt. I mean, that's where I am mentally. It's like, okay, how can I at least ease a little bit of the people's world around me, so that, because community is going to be very, very important, and that we form communities of trust and support as things become more and more difficult.
Comes back to it takes a village.
Bingo.
Yeah, and Kaylee was mentioning in the chat, in other words, what are some small acts of mindfulness or awareness that we can lean on to amplify the message? And I think you were saying one of them is kindness. Just that is a small act that could go a long way.
Wherever and however you have the capacity to practice it.
Yeah. Let's see here. Do you mind if we jump into a little bit about the automatic Earth again there, Stephen? Will Morris is asking a question about the automatic Earth. What does the rest of the piece represent about the future of the Earth? He's asking you to look into the future. In addition, I noticed similarities with the beginning and the end of the piece. Maybe talk a little bit about the form, and it seems to be intertwined between the movements. I think we call that through composed, right? So all the movements.
All right, yeah, so let's get a little wonky and music nerd.
We'll use our music jargon.
Yes.
At this point.
So any piece of music I write, for me, it's very, very important that it be coherent and built from a very small amount of initial material. So even though this is a pretty long, sprawling work, there's only a few different kind of building block musical ideas that everything springs from. That's how it hopefully feels like a coherent whole. And that's really important to me. Developing a single motive. I mean, look at Beethoven 5. There's kind of the archetype of that. It's all built out of just 4 notes. So yeah, the music comes back, and that opening sound, that pulsing sound you heard ends the 4th movement as well. All of that is very intentional. However, I don't think of it as very specific meaning, like bar 400 means this happens, the world ends. I don't think in such literal terms. If I could think in those clear terms, I'd probably write a novel instead. But I love the ambiguity of and how that's what you took from it. Now, certainly I can see how that feels like it, but I don't think it's not so final as the world ends. The world's not going to end. It's just habitability is going to be really difficult for humans. It will continue to exist. It's just we're going to have a rough time of it. So you're asking about what the 5th movement is then, this kind of quiet, undulating waves of maybe almost watery music, except it's called the language of light. And that's, I don't know. I mean, there's no way to know what's coming, but I imagine that what it looks like to be human is itself going to change. I mean, we're on that track anyway, and that's only going to be accelerated. Again, as I said, of desperation. So are people going to try to exist virtually, if that's possible? Is artificial intelligence on a general level possible? I think so. I'm not sure, but if it is, I think it's inevitable and very rapidly within our lifetimes. What does that mean for those of us who remain flesh and blood? Or do we? I don't know. I mean, I could throw out a million different crazy, bizarre scenarios, but I can't tell you that the music is about any one of those. I want you to sit with the uncertainty. Just like in science, you cannot say for sure this is what's happening. And I want you to just languish there in that and sort of let, quantum superposition of possible futures wash over you and spur you to think about that. So I don't have an easy answer for you. But it does end, the whole piece ends with a very big sort of tense question mark. That's intentional. I don't know if I answered your question, but I talked a whole lot, so there's that.
Stephen, I really like the fact that you went through that waterish phase with all the blue light and the music that felt like you were underwater with the melting ice sheets and rising sea levels. That's exactly the way people in Miami are going to feel if Greenland melts, where sea level is going to go up about 6 meters. So if you think of putting 6 meters of water in San Diego, so if all the ice melts off of Greenland, sea level goes up 6 meters. If all the ice melts off Antarctica, sea level goes up 30 meters. So if we melt all the ice that we have on our 2 major bodies of ice in the world, Antarctica and Greenland, that's 36 meters of sea level rise. And if you start to think about what that's going to do to the coastline and what it's going to do to the majority of the population of the world, which lives in close proximity to sea level, your piece with moving into this time of waves and blue water and things washing over individuals, that's the that's the phase that you move to actually in any area that's near present day sea level, looking forward into the future.
Yeah, most of Florida is going to be underwater. I've done a map where you can raise it up like here's what 1 meter, 2 meters, 3 meters of water rise, and it floods it very rapidly. I don't buy property in Florida, people. Just don't do that. Do not do that.
We had another question, and I'm going to ask Alan this one because I believe I know your answer for it. I think it's going to be good. Thanks to all the panelists. Devin asks, do you believe that music, especially what we've heard today, is acting as an adequate mechanism to convey the seriousness and direness of the situation we face?
So I will answer that with yes, and the piece that Steven has presented is a giant megaphone, and it draws attention. It makes things uncomfortable. It makes you kind of feel like this is where we're headed, and that in itself is immensely powerful to draw people's attention to it. But you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. So you've got the giant megaphone that's drawing everybody's attention to the topic, but we still have to get people to understand what their actions are and what the impacts of those actions are on our systems. And that's the piece where we really then need to bring the science interjected with it and closely linked to the arts. So the arts provide a great way to create engagement and awareness and be able to work together as a group to bring this out. And it's not only the scientists that can answer some of these questions. There's a lot of things that you can do with art to convey to individuals the conceptual world that we're working with. And with the capacity of abstract art, ceramics, sculptures, and photography, and music, and novels, and creative writing, there are so many different venues that we can all bring together just to interpret the world through the scientific lens, through geology and biology and chemistry. And once again, to really truly address the question that Devin answered or asked, in order to answer it, it takes a village. It's going to be all of us working together from all sorts of different aspects and coming at from all sides.
I could really see a great initiative would be artists collaborating with scientists and doing hyper-local projects that illustrate the effects and impact to that local community. Like if you're on the coast, here's which streets are going to be flooded. Here's what it's going to feel like about our life that's relevant to those people right there. And just an amazing, mass of very specific projects from artists that are local to that area and scientists that are there, that makes it very real and personal to you instead of, this big, broad, worldwide problem. I could see that having an impact on people if they see very specifically illustrated how their lives are going to change.
There are some art installations that I've seen around the world in various different locations that actually try to convey things like that. For instance, in Brisbane, the Brisbane River floods and can flood quite dramatically. And there are several buildings along the waterfront of that river that have lines on them that show where the water was. And they've done art installations with photography of then and now and during the floods of what was happening. They've left some debris lines in different places. They've created sculptures that show how high the water was and the impact of some of that water during those flooding events. And I've seen things like that work really well to convey, this is what we think the world actually is. And this is what can happen when things don't go the way that we think they're going to go, when we get too much rain, or how low the river drops when we get not enough rain. So there are a lot of really great installations of artwork that really convey to the landscape climate change.
All right, we actually have some students on the panel with us that I'd like to invite in to ask some questions. So Claire Tongpalad, would you mind coming in? Welcome.
Hi, Dr. Kitelinger, how are you? I'm trying to turn my video on, but it doesn't seem to be.
Oh, that's okay. You can be a white font for now. That's fine.
Okay, sounds good. Hi, Stephen. Hi, Alan. Thank you so much for being here today. This has been really interesting. I have a question. I was just curious, where do you, both of you, stand on whether or not and what the US government's role should be regarding global warming and climate change, and kind of how we fit in with what they're doing or not doing?
Well, I'm sure Alan could talk more about specific policy, but we need widespread and complete, like this infrastructure bill, that sort of thing, except maybe times 100. Just radical investment and education and awareness across the board in every aspect. And legislation is vitally important to changing this for real. I mean, we can all talk and awareness and all this sort of thing, but the real boring but impactful legislation that could happen has to happen, and it has to happen now. And we have to move fast. And the government, the U.S. government, wields a lot of power and has a lot of money, and could radically change things very rapidly and act as a guide for helping, as Alan said earlier, to share that what we develop with the world. And there has to be complete and absolute sharing of that. And so this whole idea of holding back technology as a profit motive and that sort of thing, we don't have time for that.
And I would just double down on what Stephen said about, it is going to take everybody, and the power of, if we pass legislation that does something, it's not enough to do legislation here in the US. The US has to wield its global power to be able to influence, and things like the Kyoto Accord and the Paris Climate Agreement, to get those to actually go through. And keep in mind, the Paris Climate Accord is as good as it is, it's voluntary. It is not anything that has any teeth behind it. But if you don't make those goals, then there's nothing that's going to happen. So we need to have something that causes accountability as we move forward with these, because if it's just something where we're trying to police ourselves, and the world communities are trying to police themselves, we know that doesn't always work well. You put a fox in a hen house, and inevitably at some point that fox is going to eat one of the hens, regardless of whether or not that fox tells you, "Oh, I'm not here to eat anybody. I'm just here to help."
I've heard the word culpability come up a few times. I'd like to bring in Amanda Ezel to ask a question at this point. Amanda, welcome.
Thank you, Dr. Kitelinger. So the question I was thinking about was, well, first, I think I speak for everyone when I say this project has been an incredible experience for everyone involved. At the same time, it has also taken a significant amount of resources in order to make it happen. And while music and art has the ability to affect listeners, it is especially impactful for those involved in making it. From an educational standpoint, how can we adapt these kinds of collaborative experiences in a way that makes them accessible for young musicians and future geologists and scientists, and etc., so that they can experience this level of enrichment?
Thanks, Amanda. That's, in a perfect world, we'd be able to give everybody experiences like this in every single classroom at every single level. And you said it takes a lot of resources. It really does. And the educational pedagogy that we're working with has kind of moved along. And if you kind of listen to some of the speak and some of the jargon that faculty members use as they're trying to develop courses, we start talking about things that are called high impact educational activities. And what you just went through is a perfect example of a high impact educational activity. And to be able to bring those more and get experiential learning into the classroom, and get away from doing the specific direct teaching exactly to the test, and allowing our students to have the creative thinking and the creative capacity to analyze a situation, think creatively about how to solve it, look, use critical creativity and critical thinking. You know, we're going to develop a society that's going to be much more capable of addressing problems and situations if we allow everybody to use the creativity that we all have. It may not be in the same thing. Even though I did play trombone a long time ago, one of the reasons I stopped is that, you know, joking around with my father, it was that I couldn't carry a tune in a 5-gallon bucket. So, but I do really well as a geologist, and I can think creatively about how aspects of the earth processes interrelate to each other. So to be able to rely on that creativity and give individuals the interaction and the capacity to engage with that is the way that we're going to have to reform our educational process in order to have everybody be able to experience the types of things that you just have.
Thank you.
Yeah, education is everything, and creative, high impact education. I mean, that needs to be completely overhauled. I'm the son of 2 public school teachers, so I value it highly. And I know how much work it is. And it is the glue, and teachers are the glue that holds our civilization together and transmit a way of being from one generation to the next. And that way of thinking has to be vital to a critical, creative thinking. So that would be a very fundamental thing that needs to happen. Is, you know, absolute high-end funding for every school district and every school, and not tied to local property taxes and all that. That's just nuts. You know, so these projects, like you said, could happen for every single student.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Amanda. I enjoyed some of the collaboration, even in the chat. I enjoyed earlier that they think we all get along in music and the arts, and we agree on what's good and bad. That's fantastic. I think it's fun to get to know a little bit. And Alan, we've gotten to know you a little bit in the arts side of this collaboration, that you played the trombone, but apparently you couldn't carry a tune. Steven, any scientific background or ever you said you're the son of 2 public school teachers, arts teachers?
My dad was a high school band director and really, really great trumpet player, really soulful jazz player, and just a great teacher. My mom taught elementary school and reading specifically, and was a reading specialist. So, you know, high value in education. I also saw how much work it was to teach. I don't know, I knew I didn't have the stamina to do that in a public school setting. But they, yeah, so I always have found science fascinating, and the scientific thought, the scientific method, and absolutely think that's critically important way of thinking, and teaching people to think about the world. But I don't think I had the rigor to go down and actually be an actual scientist. I like making things up too much, and being able to mold reality and shape the sound experience over time is just, that visceral experience was just too much of a draw. So that's where I've always been in my life. I, you know, majored in composition from my very first year in college. I was writing music in high school, so I don't think I ever had another path that was possible for me.
How would you say this is a broad question, I'm going to put you on the spot for it. How would you say your composition differs today from maybe when you first started, or undergrad at least?
Hopefully it's better.
Yeah.
Wow, that's a big question. Several of the pieces are bigger. I don't know. It's hopefully more subtle, even though the music you played was the opposite of subtle. But in general, more nuance and more balance, proportion, dealing with time, and your experience of time as a listener is the thing I think about the most. And imagining what it is like to sit and experience this piece of music. That's what I spent most of my time pondering, and like, is this going on too long or not long enough? And cutting music out and adding things and stretching that, as much as the note choices, is everything. It's the hardest thing because it is a subjective experience. And so hopefully I've gotten better at doing that and getting closer on my first try. But it never gets easier. I think, like anything that you want to excel at, it just never gets easier. Hopefully you get better, but it never gets easier. I don't have a better answer than that. I don't know. It's so subjective. I try not to think about myself and my oeuvre too often. That just leads to hubris and weirdness.
Yeah. Thanks, I appreciate it. I know we've enjoyed performing your works, and we're not done with the automatic earth. I think we've got something else in the future with it. I told Zach the same thing, and I think I keep coming back to why we would program it again. And one of the big reasons is we want an audience to experience in a space the piece like you just said, the way we were able to experience in a space. I think I shared this story with you, and I'll share it with everybody here, that the first time we got in that hall and played that piece about a month ago, the very first cutoff, and it resonated, was a year of relief off everybody's shoulders. And it just felt so wonderful. So thank you for bringing something that we could perform and have that moment with a year later.
My pleasure. I'm jealous too. I haven't heard any music live in well over a year, certainly not my own. So I can't wait to be a part of that moment. So you as well.
Great. And Alan, yeah, you'd like to ask a question of the students, I believe.
Yeah, so we've been sitting here talking about our experiences with Steven composing the piece and his influence in composing the piece, and my influence from the sciences and how I view the piece and together. And we've had at least 2 individuals that have spoken who were actually in the orchestra that performed it. And I'd really like to know how this made them feel, sitting watching the automatic earth and having that, all the things that made me as a member of the audience slightly uncomfortable, of the changing of the lights and the changing of the volume and all the rapid shifts and the kind of uncomfortableness of the way the music kind of was assembled. What did that make them feel like as they were actually performing this piece?
I've been talking in the chat. We're going to have Sam jump in and talk.
Hello. So I'm really happy you asked that question. I think to every student, this piece meant something different. All of our experiences in regards to climate change and how we take action against climate change is very individual and personal to every person. And for me in particular, I care a lot about the climate, and I try to do what I can when possible to make decisions that are good for the environment. And so this piece, to me, it was not only really cool. Thank you, Steven, for writing it. It's like one of the coolest pieces I've ever played as a wind player, but I think it also was very eye-opening. We talked a lot about the piece making us feel uncomfortable, and I can definitely say there were times where I felt uncomfortable, but I think that uncomfortable feeling is necessary in order for us to take a look at ourselves individually and realize what we're doing on an individual basis to contribute to that uncomfortableness that's created by climate change. So overall, I think it was a good experience to reflect personally on how I'm affecting the environment, but also on what we can do as musicians to bring attention and action to the issue.
Thanks, Sam.
So we are just about out of time, and I want to give our panelists one more time to speak if there's anything else they'd like to share just with our group here of our attendees and our panel as well. So Steven or Alan.
Well, I just put the link in I mentioned earlier from that author, Emily Johnston, Love and the Vanishing World. Just worth a read. It's not too long for any of you. Thank you, Sam, for sharing your thoughts. I am always curious how my music impacts people. Chris Garcia says, I was glad I had earplugs. Yes, I'm sorry. That moment is ridiculously loud, and you did not get that from the video until you experience it live. It's oppressive. When possible, like blinders, like a rock concert with the lights are shining on the audience, where you're blinded, the bass is so visceral, your entire body is shaking, you're feeling you press back in the seat. And I only do that once in the piece, and you wait for a long time for it, and it's shocking. And I don't usually go for such big, blunt, aggressive gestures, but it felt like you cannot turn away from this, and you cannot escape it, and you can't just ignore it. And so that's sort of what I was going for. So yeah, you need earplugs. I don't really need to injure anybody, but I need you to be unable to escape it for that moment. So it's fascinating to hear your thoughts. Thank you very much for having me be part of this, and it means the world to me that it has some impact at all, because there are oftentimes I feel helpless as a musician. Like, how can I make the world better? So means a lot to me. Thank you.
Thanks, Stephen.
I'd like to thank Steven for writing this wonderful piece, as well as Zach for the other piece that we're going to hear tomorrow when we interact with it. And that it's a world premiere is another fantastic opportunity that we have at San Diego State to engage with the arts and sciences and the culture and the world around us. Shannon, thanks for doing an amazing job producing these with your team, putting together the video and all the challenges that you've done. I can't imagine what it was like, seeing those students in Montezuma Hall actually playing instruments with masks on is just amazing. I get wear a mask when I fly this through a mask to be able to play some of the music that we just experienced. And to all the students that were the performers that put on these pieces for us, wow, the job you did was just absolutely amazing. I hope you take this experience with you for the rest of your life. It's a fantastic thing to be able to be a part of. And I hope everybody else that's out there in the audience is going to take some of our discussions to heart, and wherever you have an opportunity to do a little bit, every little bit helps. And it's going to take everybody doing a little bit to get there. So what you can do, we'd really appreciate it. And most of all, hey, thanks to Eric and his team for making the Arts Alive program such an amazing interaction between science and arts and culture and everything that we have in the world, bringing us all together. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks everybody. Thank you, Stephen. Thank you, Alan. Can we do our virtual thank you to our guests here today on the panel for being part of this and giving of their time and sharing everything they have? It's fantastic. Thank you so much. This concludes our discussion. I'm going to turn things over to Michelle at this point for the remainder. Thank you, everybody.
Yes, let's please give a huge thank you to Shannon, Alan, and Stephen for such a stimulating conversation and for providing a space to have these essential dialogues as we move into the next phase here after COVID, hopefully after COVID. So again, just please share your gratitude in the chat. And just as a reminder, the performance of Winds of Change will be streamed for free on the School of Music and Dance YouTube channel beginning at noon tomorrow. So that's Friday, April 23rd. And that will be available for viewing until Friday, April 30th. The link to access the page will be posted in the chat box. Thank you, Elizabeth. So you're free to view it there. Also, we will be emailing a survey to everyone who registered for this event, and we would be so grateful for your responses. It will help us improve our programming. We also hope that you attend other events sponsored by One SDSU and Arts Alive SDSU, which you can learn about at onesdsu.edu and also at artsalivesdsu.edu. Thank you again for joining us this afternoon, and I hope you all have an amazing rest of your day. Thank you, folks.